Hello, I'm Angela Saini. Welcome to The Food Chain, fuel for the hungry mind from the BBC World Service. We bring you the economic, science and culture behind what we eat and drink. The UN's Food and Agricultural Organization last year put the number of hungry people in the world at 805 million. If there is enough food for everyone, it's certainly not reaching everyone. So this week we're asking whether it's right for governments to step in and subsidise food. We're spanning the globe to hear from those on the breadline. In Egypt, a new system introduced by the government promises to end long queues for cheap bread.
People were hungry and desperate and used to get into fights. Sometimes people in the queue even died. I'm very happy it's much more organised now.
And we hear from Americans who rely on food stamps.
I know I got some food to put in my refrigerator and food to feed my kids. And I appreciate that, you know what I'm saying?
All that and more on today's edition of The Food Chain. First, let's dissect exactly what food stamps, vouchers and handouts are and why governments use them. For that, we're going to turn to an expert. John Hodnott researches the economics and policy of food at Cornell University in the US. Earlier, he explained to The Food Chain why governments have a duty to feed us.
Any government who is a signatory to the United Nations Universal Declaration of Human Rights has an obligation to ensure their citizens have access to food. Pretty much every government around the world does pay for our food in some way and at some level, but the way they do is radically different from country to country.
So how do these systems differ? Well, it's very much like any other kind of welfare or government benefit. How much people get depends on the politics of the country, how wealthy it is, and of course the needs of its people. John Hodnott again on the variety of approaches out there.
Governments can pay for our food or contribute to the payments for our food in one of two ways. They can assist producers or they can assist consumers. Typically, governments which assist producers do so through some form of subsidy scheme. It's schemes we see in the United States, throughout the European Union, and in much of the developing world. Alternatively, and arguably more effectively, governments can assist consumers through either subsidies or the transfer of resources. There are some countries in the Middle East, for example, where these subsidies can be several percentage points of GDP. Other countries give virtually nothing. And yet in other countries, again, they provide assistance to access to food through social protection or social safety net programs. And these typically run on the order of 0.25% to 0.5% of GDP.
But as a means of feeding people, how effective are direct handouts of food or food vouchers? Would it be more helpful or even cheaper for governments to just give out cash and allow people to make their own choices? Hodnott's research in Ecuador, Niger, Yemen and Uganda shows that cash transfers like these can be more effective than people think.
Oftentimes people worry that if you give people transfers, that they're just going to waste them. They're going to spend them on alcohol or cigarettes, or they're just going to stop working altogether. And in these studies, we find no evidence of that whatsoever. Where food markets are thick, where there's a wide variety of foods easily available, cash has significant advantages, not only because people can consume a diverse basket of foods, but also because the cost providing that transfer, in the form of cash, is considerably less than that of providing the transfer in the form of food.
That was John Hodnott from Cornell University. Now, high food prices are one reason that Egypt chooses to subsidise food, specifically the highly popular staple aish baladi, Egyptian bread. The government kept its prices low by handing out heavily subsidised wheat flour to bakeries, which could then, in turn, sell bread for as little as 1 cent a loaf. So important have these subsidies been that in Egypt, the politics of bread has become the politics of people. Changes to the system and bread shortages have even sparked riots in the past. Now, responding to complaints that people had no choice but to join long bakery queues early in the mornings to make sure they could buy baladi before it ran out, the new government has introduced a smart card system, allowing families to buy 5 loaves per person any time of day. For The Food Chain, Esther Meerman reports.
The sound of a bakery in Cairo. Men in blue overalls are shoving big trays of unbaked bread into an oven while extremely noisy machines prepare the dough. There used to be long queues of customers here every morning, but since the government of President Sisi introduced a new smart card system a few months ago, the lines have disappeared. The cashier explains how the system works. For every family member on the smart card, a maximum of 5 pieces of subsidized bread can be bought per day. The system is not perfect yet, she says. Some people who work here but live outside the city don't have a card yet. I only have a very limited amount of bread to sell to them. They sometimes get angry and yell at me if the bread for them runs out. We're working to get all people eligible for subsidized bread registered in the new system, but it takes time, says Mahmoud Diab, spokesperson for the Ministry of Supply, who are in charge of the smart cards. In the meantime, the bakeries get a few thousand pieces of bread extra every day to sell to people without cards. Access to food has long been a source of public anger in Egypt. One of the main slogans in the 2011 Egyptian revolution was for bread, freedom and social justice.
Food was a key element of making life livable in Egypt in early 2011, and it was a key part of the demands of people by saying we want bread, which means we want food.
Angus Blair, an analyst on the Egyptian economy, thinks the card system is a step in the right direction.
It's an efficient process that actually cuts the loss through corruption of flour as much as possible, and then in the end makes people more alert to how much bread that they're using.
I used to have to get up early in the morning to get bread before it ran out, this man remembers. Very often there just wasn't enough for everybody because a lot of people were buying too much. People were hungry and desperate and used to get into fights. Sometimes people in the queue even died. I'm very happy it's much more organized now. According to Mahmoud Diab, the government is saving millions of Egyptian pounds on bread subsidies since the smart card system was implemented. He says all the money saved goes right back into other subsidies on food items. The new smart card system has certainly improved the way people get their bread, but Angus Blair says Egypt's fundamental issue of feeding an overpopulated country with subsidized food still needs to be solved.
Egypt really has to look for ways to also increase food production internally. And over time it's to be hoped that the subsidy would be cut. But it's very difficult, it's too emotional to be cut.
With many other pressing issues for the government to deal with, it's unlikely Egypt's food subsidies will disappear anytime soon. The men in the blue overalls will continue their noisy bread making for some time.
Esther Meerman in Cairo. Egypt isn't the only place where food subsidies have become politicised. In India, home to a quarter of the world's undernourished people, the 2013 National Food Security Act promised to provide subsidised grains to 2/3 of the population. But this hasn't been without controversy. Shilpa Kannan in the BBC's Delhi Bureau explains how food subsidies there work.
India has one of the world's largest welfare schemes. The law makes food a legal right and provides cheap grain every month to some 800 million poor people. This group includes pregnant women, lactating mothers, children between the ages of 6 months and 14 years, malnourished children, and destitute and homeless people. You can easily see why this is important. Just on this street in central Delhi, there are groups of poor children begging for food and money. India has the largest number of malnourished children in the world, a rate worse than the average in Africa. And this scheme is intended to combat hunger. As part of it, India buys grains such as rice and wheat from farmers at above market prices and sells a part of it to poor households and stockpiles the rest to guard against shortages. So it protects both farmers but also provides affordable food to many. By one estimate, India needs about 60 million tons of food stocks to service this plan. India's food subsidy was the cause of a major rift with the US at the WTO. The two countries recently achieved a breakthrough on this. But there are many economists even within India who question, should the country be funding such an expensive scheme? It has more than doubled the country's annual food subsidy bill to more than $23 billion. But the government insists that money is not a problem.
Shilpa Khan there. So what was India's row with the World Trade Organization about? To give us some insight, I'm joined in the studio now by Biraj Patnaik, an advisor to India's Supreme Court on the right to food and part of India's Right to Food campaign. So Biraj, the issue that these countries had was that India was distorting the market somehow. What was the problem with India having subsidies at all?
Most of the subsidies in the US, for instance, go into commodities that are used for exports. India, on the other hand, uses these commodities to feed its poor. So India's argument was that it could scarcely be market distorting since food grains that were procured from farmers went directly to the consumers, whereas the US and the EU believed that companies from anywhere in the world should be able to export food to India.
And where does the dispute stand at the moment? Is it resolved?
Well, as of now, India's won round one, so to speak, and India and other developing countries have obtained a peace clause, which means that they cannot be dragged to the dispute settlement mechanism of the WTO till such time that a permanent solution is achieved.
In terms of food subsidies more generally then, so why does India choose to give subsidised grains, essentially almost food handouts to the poor, rather than maybe just giving them cash or some other kind of welfare?
Cash subsidies work very well in many parts of the world. But in India, because the government procures directly from farmers and gives a subsidy, that grain needs to be passed on somewhere, and therefore it goes to the consumer. If you gave cash, we are a very gender inequitous society. Cash is controlled by men, food is controlled by women in the household. So for many reasons, cash transfers have not been considered to be a very efficient way of transferring subsidies.
Now, while India's subsidies have created some global controversy, even within the country, there is controversy about whether they should exist at all or what level they should be. Can you explain that? Is there a political split here?
Yes, absolutely. There is a political split because we have a government now which doesn't believe that government should be in the business of handing out subsidies, and that these subsidies should instead go to corporates who would create employment, who would therefore give jobs and so on.
This differs greatly from what the Congress government prior to the current government, led by the BJP, is saying. So for Congress, it was very important to give handouts to the poor.
Well, I think the Congress did a balancing act, which was to ensure that while they gave away large amounts of money to corporates in subsidies to the tune of £60 billion in the last budget that they passed, they also retained the balance by creating schemes and programs in order to keep the social balance in the social fabric intact. The BJP doesn't seem to be very enthusiastic about this approach.
So does the BJP ideologically believe that there should be food subsidies to the poor?
The BJP believes that these subsidies should be pared down, and that's very clear. They have just brought out a report, the government, which has recommended that subsidies should be cut from 67% of the population
and
brought down to 40%.
What is the reason for that? Is it the cost? It's very expensive, this program.
Well, it's primarily the cost, but I don't think so, because this is a country that spends close to $25 billion on defense. So if we can spend $25 billion on defense, we can surely spend $20 billion on food subsidies.
Can the people survive without these food subsidies?
No, absolutely not. The evidence is clear from across the globe, both in developing and developed countries, that after the food crisis of 2008, we have seen increasing number of people depending on handouts. I don't think you can deal with the problem of global hunger without subsidies.
Biraj Patnaik, thank you so much for joining us. You're listening to The Food Chain on the BBC World Service with me, Angela Saini. This week we're asking whether governments should pay for our food. We've already heard that, according to the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, most countries do in fact have an obligation to feed their people. In the developing world, where food prices can be too high for the poor, food subsidies can even be a political tool. But how about in wealthier nations? Do governments in the developed world also need to hand out food? Perhaps not on quite the same scale, but sometimes, yes. In the United States, the Supplemental Nutrition Assistance Program, or SNAP, better known as food stamps, helps more than 46 million people. Dating back to the 1930s, when malnutrition was a real risk to many Americans, it's grown into one of the most important welfare schemes in the country. This week, lawmakers in Washington began a review of SNAP, asking whether it needs to be scaled back. Republicans in particular are calling for deep cuts to the programme's $74 billion budget. The BBC's Matt Wells is in New York and has been hearing both sides of the debate, starting with those using food stamps.
Another grocery sale goes through the cash register at this busy supermarket in Brooklyn. But it's not cash or a credit card that's being used. This shopper's using an EBT card, electronic benefit transfer, which for families who can claim it averages out at about $130 extra to spend a month on nutritional food. There's even an incentive thrown in here in New York to shop at some of the city's green markets using your SNAP credit. Plenty of people coming in here qualify, and thanks to the Great Recession, there was a 75% increase in claimants between 2006 and 2013. But with confidence rising, are food stamp recipients now looking forward to giving up their government handouts? The message I get here is don't be fooled by the figures.
The EBT card, it helps so much. Now that people lost their job, it's not easy for the people to feed the family. The more important thing, the people eat, and then you wait for the job.
If you didn't have the benefits, do you think you could feed your family in a healthy way, or would it be hard?
It's going to be hard.
Do you think too many people have access to the food benefits?
Well, I can't really say that. All I can say is I got mine. I know I got some food to put in my refrigerator and food to feed my kids. And I appreciate that, you know what I'm saying?
What would you do if it was taken away?
Well, right now, I'm on disability, so I can't go back to work. I'm not lazy.
Pascual, te esperan, Pascual.
There's still a stigma attached to it. The few food stamp recipients happy to talk didn't want to give their names. But the decision about how much they get in the future is now a subject of fierce debate again on Capitol Hill. Help low-income people help themselves by ending the dependency culture of benefits, say most Republicans. Many Democrats argue that keeping genuine hunger at bay and maintaining a healthy workforce is only possible thanks to SNAP. I brought together Joel Berg, Executive Director of the NYC Coalition Against Hunger, together with Diana Furchtgott-Roth, a Senior Fellow at the Manhattan Institute and a former Chief Economic Advisor to Republican President George Bush.
Even though GDP growth is growing at about 2.5% a year, the unemployment rate is now 5.7%. Food stamp use has not declined. There's more than 46 million Americans on food stamps, and it costs $74 billion a year. So the question is why, more than 5 years after the end of the recession, has it not declined?
First of all, what she said isn't factually true. Between November 2012 and November 2014, there's a 1.3 million person drop in SNAP participation. The program skyrocketed in use under President George W. Bush. It skyrocketed in use under President Obama because the need was there. So I'd respectfully suggest the question isn't how many people are getting on it or is it going up or getting down. How many people need it? 49 million Americans live in households that can't afford enough food. So it shouldn't be a shock that 46 million Americans need government help to eat.
The cost of $74 billion a year is twice the program's 2008 cost. We've had 6 years of President Barack Obama to help the economy.
I mean, is this really, though, only about economics, or is this really about the whole notion that the economy has become a dependency culture?
It infuriates me a bit when we only say that the small percentage of the budget that goes to poor people, somehow that is a bad thing in dependency, when in fact all of us benefit from government.
Diana, unemployment's gone down, but the fact is that a lot of these jobs that have been created are part-time jobs, and there are lots of people who qualify for food stamps who are working, and surely there is a strong case to say that in order to improve the health of the country overall down the line, people need to eat well.
They do need to eat well. They also need to dress well, and they need to live in warm homes, but it doesn't mean the government should be giving them the clothes and giving them the houses. The structure of the food stamps program, I think, is one reason why it has continued to be so high and so widely used. You can hear advertisements in my state, Maryland, encouraging people to apply for food stamps.
Just by her comments, there's sort of a disdain that, goodness forbid, we would let people know that they're eligible for a program. At least 20% of the people eligible for these programs, working people, working hard and playing by the rules, don't get these benefits primarily because we've demonized them, that gave the false impression only when poor people need help is that bad.
And yet, Joel, I'd say that in New York, an average family of 4 that earns $2,500 a month qualifies for food stamps. I think a lot of people listening would be surprised that the threshold's that high.
Basically, if you're above, let's say, $25,000 to $28,000 $1,000 a year. Most families aren't qualified. And the truth of the matter is there are 3.1 million people or so in New York City, poor enough, low income enough to be eligible for Medicaid, but 1 million fewer than that get food stamps. So the truth is half of the city is poor and near poor.
I am not arguing that we should eliminate the program altogether. The structure of the program needs changing. The eligibility requirements need scaling back. And the best way to do that is to put each state in charge of their own food stamp budget. The pressure to increase food stamp spending is not just from Democrats. It's also from Republicans in agricultural states. They benefit because the U.S. Department of Agriculture buys more of their products, spends more on food stamps that benefit them.
May I just ask you, when was the last time you actually met a family receiving food stamps and had a conversation about what the program means to them? I thought so. And can I ask, when's the last time you met a low-wage worker who complained that the minimum wage raised and lost them their job?
I live with a minimum wage worker, so...
And did they lose their job when the wages were increased?
They were told that if the wages were higher, then they would lose their job.
My point is, the right can say all it wants, that raises in the minimum wage reduce jobs, reduce wages, increase inflation, but a number of states have raised the minimum wage, California, New York, and there's not an iota of proof. And I said, challenge the right. If you're against food stamps, then be for higher wages.
That's mommy right there.
Joel Berg ending that report from Matt Wells. Across the border from the US in Canada, access to affordable food for some is also a problem, but for an entirely different reason. The Northern Territory of Nunavut overlaps with the Arctic, and it's home mainly to the indigenous Inuit. Getting food to this remote community is so difficult that groceries have become eye-wateringly expensive for many. A news report in 2012 listed cabbages selling for $28 and baby formula at $55 a box. It's such a problem that many Inuit say they miss meals, even go days without eating. And they want the Canadian government to act. Elise Skera from the Canadian Broadcasting Corporation has this report from Nunavut.
Tanya Inuktitut's freezer is nearly empty.
Like this, half of this.
A package with 3 small pieces of meat will have to go a long way. Along with a few vegetables and a bowl of rice, that's all she'll feed her family of 9 for 2 days.
It's the most stressful feeling you can ever go through, just to watch your child hungry and say, I'm hungry. And I know I'm trying.
Most of the time, Mrs. Inuktitut smiles when she sits with her children, but just talking about the high cost of food in Nunavut brings her to tears. A bottle of juice that might cost $1 Canadian or about 80 American cents in Ottawa or Toronto can cost anywhere from $5 to $30 north of the Arctic Circle. Mrs. Inuktitut has a regular job as a secretary. Most days, she says that salary isn't enough.
For me, every day when I wake up, okay, what shall I do today to make money so I can buy food for my children?
Nunavut's frozen tundra spans more than 2 million square kilometers, and it's home to about 30,000 people, spread out among 25 remote communities. There are no roads connecting Nunavut to the rest of Canada, and the water surrounding the communities is frozen for much of the year. Aeroplanes bring food in regularly, and that's expensive. Lisi Papatsi has been protesting about high food prices in the north for several years. She says people like her are not asking for a lot.
I know in the north it's always going to be more expensive. We're not asking for southern prices. We're asking for just a little bit cheaper prices and food that are not rotten.
Ms. Papatsi's popular Facebook group, Feeding My Family, is getting national attention, with photos of $30 Cheese Whiz, $70 bags of breaded chicken strips, and $200 turkeys. The site has spurred hundreds of southern Canadians to donate boxes of food to Nunavut families. And while Ms. Papatsi is grateful, she says that is a Band-Aid solution.
Northerners shouldn't have to get so much donations from all over. That should not even happen in Canada, not in a developed country.
There is a government program that tackles this issue. Nutrition North gives money directly to food retailers, a system that Ms. Papatsi says doesn't work. She says it's too easy for retailers to inflate prices and take advantage of the fact their stores may be the only place where Northerners can shop. The government's independent auditor agrees the data on the program doesn't add up. In a recent report, Auditor General of Canada Michael Ferguson said, since the goal of the program is to make healthy food more affordable, it should define what people should be able to afford. Mr. Ferguson also said Aboriginal Affairs and Northern Development Canada should record more information about prices and spoilage.
But in order for the department to know whether it's all being passed on, they need to know, what's the wholesale cost of the food, what's the cost of transporting it, what's the profit margin of the retailers, and what's the final selling price. And they're not collecting that information.
The Northwest Company is one of Nunavut's biggest retailers. It says high prices directly relate to the high cost of shipping food by air or storing food that's shipped up during the short open water season. Derek Reimer speaks for the company. He says they do their best to make prices affordable and pass on every dollar from Nutrition North to consumers.
I believe additional funding is needed to make the program sustainable and to have the impact that people are looking for. So more funding would definitely be an answer, and that's something I think we could work with a group like Feeding My Family and other groups to try and get that message across.
The Canadian government says it is committed to making Nutrition North work, and it's put out a call for proposals on ways to improve the subsidy program. For Tanya Inuk-Killickty and her children, that change can't come soon enough.
I'm not too sure if anyone down south understands how we struggle on a daily basis sometimes.
Elise Scarra reporting from Canada. And with that, we end this week's edition of The Food Chain. Now it's your turn. Do you think governments should pay for our food? Or do you think we're responsible for feeding ourselves? Please tweet us at BBC World Service or with the hashtag BBC Food Chain, or get in touch on Facebook through the website bbcworldservice.com. And do join us again next week.